Welcome back, and it is my pleasure to introduce Ivor Davis, a friend of mine and a writer and journalist who has, as I said earlier, had a front row seat to history, and he's written this book about his experiences with the Beatles called The Beatles and Me on Tour. So you were basically embedded with the Beatles in their 1964 first US tour. Tell us about your first meeting with the Fab Four.
Well, first of all, it's a delight to be beyond the red carpet, because as a journalist, you never get to actually be on the red carpet.
No, we don't.
It's all the movie stars and the celebrities that do it, and you just give them distance, as you know. You don't get in the way of the star.
Well, today you're our star.
Thank you. Well, 1964, I was a journalist working for the London Daily Express, which was a huge newspaper in England in the days when people actually read newspapers.
Yeah.
Remember that? Back in the
old days.
20th century. It was in the 20th century. And my office said, the lads are coming to America, first tour, get on the plane, meet them in San Francisco, travel with them, eat with them, drink with them, and cover this tour to see if they can conquer America like they've conquered Europe. And also, my editor said, you will be the ghost writer writing George Harrison's column, because as most of us knew, George was a great musician, great on the guitar, but his writing skills left something to be desired, and that was where I came in.
Well, let me stop you for a minute there. So you ghost wrote an article for a column for George, but you didn't know him. So
I didn't know him.
How did you work with him, or how did you get his flavor?
Well, to be honest with you, George of all the Beatles was the surliest one, the least communicative one.
Wow.
He was a youngster. He was the youngest in the group, and it was very hard to make the connection. And I was supposed to sit down with him, as good journalists do, and get it straight from the heart. Get him to talk about how he felt, what his reaction was, all the things, the juicy things. But George, one problem was he never woke up until 3 in the afternoon, because they went to bed at 3 a.m. They woke up at 3 in the afternoon. It was long past my deadline. And so what happened was I sort of concocted.
You improvised.
Improvised, yes. Well, the improvisation was okay, but the problem was that George, 2 weeks into the tour, got me on the private jet that we all traveled on and said, your column that you're running under my name is a load of old, he said shite, which is, I think you get the picture.
Yeah.
So I said, George, if you sat down for me, even for half an hour, and told me what was spinning in your mind, it would work better. And after that, we got on much better, and being his ghostwriter, and so he gave me a lot better stuff than the rubbish I'd been turning out, concocting earlier. So that was my job with George, other than also covering the Beatles on this phenomenal, just an incredible, I always call it ticket to ride, because it was a ticket to ride.
Well, you've said it was a wild ride.
Wild ride.
The whole tour was a wild ride for you.
It was a wild ride because the Beatles never knew what to expect. Brian Epstein was very worried about whether the Beatles would be accepted, because many other, Cliff Richard, Tommy Steele, most people have not heard of, came over from heroes in England, came to America, fell flat. So he was worried, but as soon as I got there, I knew the moment I walked into the hotel in San Francisco and met the Beatles, and there were 2,000 girls outside the hotel screaming, I realized it was going to be big, and it was.
Did they have any inkling that they were going to be accepted in the U.S., or were they just, was it not a clue for them? Did they just, were they surprised by the whole?
I think they were surprised until the opening night in the Cow Palace in San Francisco, when they walked in there and the girls there, mostly girls screaming, took the roof off, and the only problem for most of the people in the Cow Palace in San Francisco was the fact that when the Beatles started playing their songs, you could not hear a single word, not a word, because the girls started screaming from start to finish, every single song, and so much so that along the way the Beatles couldn't hear themselves singing, and they sometimes lost their way, believe it or not. And later on in the tour, Ringo, the fabulous drummer, told me that he became a lip reader, so he knew what song song they were singing, and that was the image, and that was the picture of what happened. 35 concerts in 26 days.
Okay, so they were very young. These were the early Beatles. Were they I'm not going to say impressed, but were they upset by some of the things that were going on with their fans, or did they just accept it and just enjoy it?
They had a great sense of humor, and they were very funny. They were like English answer to the Marx Brothers. And for those of you who don't know who the Marx Brothers are, they were an American comedy team who made great comedy movies. Very madcap, very off the cuff. The Beatles were like that. They were very funny naturally. And that kind of got them through. I mean, they were pretty sensible guys, even though they were idolized by these young women. And talking about the young women, I met a few years ago some of the young women who were a little bit older, and they said, I was at that concert at the Hollywood Bowl and I was in love with Paul and Paul was in love with me. Oh, how do you mean? Well, he was smiling at me and I smiled back at him. So these young women, 14, 15, were there creating havoc, not really listening to the music, in love with various Beatles, and the Beatles kind of liked it, because don't forget, the Beatles were young, lively, with healthy libidos, and the girls were throwing themselves at the Beatles. So what's not to like? So
there were hookups on the road.
Oh, there were hookups on the road. We didn't write about it. I didn't write about it. I knew if I said that John, who was married at the time, hooked up with somebody, which I saw a little bit of hanky-panky going on on occasions. If I wrote about that, Brian Epstein, their manager, would have given me a ticket to home. So you went along with it. You went with the fun. I mean, you knew it wasn't serious. And the Beatles were having a good time. And they were trapped in their hotel, by the way. I must tell you, because they couldn't go anywhere. If they went outside, they'd been ripped to shreds. Honestly.
Literally.
Literally, because so they were stuck in the hotel. I was in the room next door, and I must say that they were forced to hang out with me, and I was forced to hang out with them, which was okay.
And you mentioned in the book, so you guys played cards and played games in the evening, when they weren't on stage. So what else did you do with them?
Well,
I mean, not with them, but what kind of games and what did you talk about?
Well, what happened was that John, who had the wicked sense of humor, liked to play Monopoly. And so at 2 o'clock in the morning, when I was about to go to sleep, John would call me and say, come over, and then he'd do the same with Kurt Gunther, who was a photographer traveling with us. Come over, we want to play Monopoly. So we went to John's at 2:30 in the morning, and played Monopoly. And I must confess, if you just keep this to yourself, that John cheated. Because every time he rolled the dice and he didn't land on the property he wanted, he rolled again. So John was a bit of a cheat. But it was fun, and we went along with it, because myself and the photographer, we were their recreation, not physical recreation, game recreation. And it was fun, because as I said, they could not step outside their hotel.
So you basically became their confidant as well.
They got comfortable. What happened was, after the first couple of days, you became part of the family, part of the furniture. They were comfortable. I mean, on the plane, Paul would come along and say, "Hi, Ivor, how you feeling? Do you want me to get you a drink?" I said, "Yeah, give me a gin and tonic." So Paul would bring me a gin and tonic. I mean, it's crazy.
You never did that to me. I only met him once.
You met Paul once, and he never offered you a drink?
No, but I wasn't covering him, and I was just there. So,
yeah.
How would you? Okay, let's look through the different personalities of the four, the Fab Four. How would you describe Paul?
Paul was always, there's a word I use, and I say it's an Irish word. It isn't an Irish word, it's a Yiddish word, and it's called schmoozer.
Oh, yes.
Paul was a gigantic schmoozer. He knew how to handle people. He was Mr. Affable. On the plane, he'd come and sit next to you. You wouldn't have to go and sit next to him. And he was just, he had this inbuilt type of humor and gentleness and niceness. So he was terrific. He was also a bit of a Lothario. Because all the girls loved him, they loved all the other Beatles, but Peggy Lipton was the actress, was a young lady that was enchanted by Paul, and Paul was enchanted with her. We didn't write about that because Paul at the time was dating Jane Asher, an English actress who he had left in London. So
okay, so this was Peggy Lipton prior to the Mod Squad.
Peggy Lipton prior to the
Mod Squad.
Just about the Mod Squad. I think
about
maybe,
the time of the Mod Squad.
Maybe she had. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, just about that. She was an up and coming young actress. She told me once at a party that we had, and the Beatles had a lot of little parties. She said, "I am going to marry Paul." She said that to me. She didn't marry Paul. She married Quincy Jones.
Yes.
As you know. And so that was Paul, a charming man, still a charming man in his 70s.
And he's still going strong.
Oh my gosh, I mean, look at Paul. If I can diverge very slightly, if you go and see Paul McCartney today, in the 21st century, he will sing and perform for 3¼ hours by himself, his performance. I'm going to ask you a question, may I?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. When the Beatles toured and I traveled with them in 1964, how long would you guess they performed for on stage at every concert? Take a guess.
Well, I read your book, so that's not fair. Go ahead.
Well, it was 26 minutes,
yes.
27 minutes.
That was not long.
I mean, can you believe an entertainer today getting on stage and leaving after less than half an hour?
No, they'd be, yeah, but these were the Beatles.
Yeah, these were the Beatles, and nobody, I mean, they had warm-up acts, you know, they had the Righteous Brothers came on before them. Jackie DeShannon came on before them. Nobody cared who came on. They could have brought on, you know, the Luton Girls Choir or the Orange County Girls Choir, if there is an Orange County Girls Choir.
I don't know about that.
Nobody cared. They just wanted the Beatles.
For the 26 minutes,
For the
they
26
were happy.
minutes. 26 minutes of unlistenable music because you couldn't hear them. Their music was great, but you couldn't hear them singing.
Okay, that's John.
Yes.
That's Paul. How about George? You said George was
George was kind of feeling his oats, as I would say. He was not the most affable. He had a great sense of humor, a very dry sense of humor. We got on better after we had this little confrontation. Right. I quite liked him, but I liked John better.
Really?
Because John was wild and wacky. John had he had a lightning fast mind. And you've done a lot of showbiz interviews, and I don't know if you ever interviewed Robin Williams.
Yes, many times.
I mean, Robin Williams was warp speed mind.
Exactly. You couldn't keep up with him.
I mean, you've done interviews with Robin. I always thought that when you did Robin Williams, and I know we're not talking about him, but he was such a genius. If you do Robin Williams and you release your tape as a long-playing album, it's a bestseller.
It was incredible. I really hated transcribing anything from Robin Williams because you'd have to keep going back because he would never stop.
Yes.
So you're saying that's what John
That was John Lennon's mind. Sharp, swift, lightning speed. And John also did impersonations. I mean, he could do. I remember we were stranded in Key West, Florida. There was a hurricane coming, and we spent 24 hours in Key West, Florida, in a motel, and we were watching in John's suite, watching Fidel Castro do his 4-hour speech. And after about 20 minutes, John stood up and did a Fidel Castro impersonation.
And he was spot on all that.
Oh, brilliant. I mean, a Liverpool lad doing Fidel Castro. And John didn't have a big bushy beard. I don't think so.
Okay, Ringo.
Ringo. Well, you know, I always say Ringo, I mean, what can you say about drummers? They're a little bit...
I'm a drummer.
Oh, you're a drummer, okay.
Yes.
Well, then I'm gonna throw this back at you.
Okay.
I mean, drummers are supposed to be a little bit crazy, a little bit off the wall.
I don't.
You don't think so? Are you a little
I
bit
guess
crazy
they
and off the
are,
wall?
not me, but go ahead.
Not you? And Ringo also was I mean, you've got to remember they're very young. I mean, you see today Ringo with his Peace and Love and Sir Ringo, Sir Richard Starkey now. Finally got the Queen of England to give him a knighthood. And Ringo was, I mean, he was a street lad from Liverpool like the other boys were. And they didn't have sophistication. They had wit, they had innate charm, innate comedy, funny guys. If you look at any of those press conferences, everywhere we went, we stopped. We had a press conference for the visiting, for all the media, the television, and the Beatles were like a comedy duo, but they never wrote the script. They played off of each other. They could finish each other's sentences. So they were an incredible quartet of musicians and human beings.
So they were quartet on and off the stage.
They were. I mean, in person, they never complained much. I mean, the only thing that they complained about, I remember, no, they didn't complain about. Brian Epstein, who was making a fortune with them, sell out concerts, kept telling them, for God's sake, cut back on all room service. Cut back on room service. So, but Brian was trying to be a fiscal guy. He was the manager. He was the guy, as you know, Brian Epstein was the guy who created the look, the image, the haircuts, the suits, and he dragged them out of the Berlin red light district, and there's kind of greasy hair, and they're smoking, swearing, talking to the audience to deliver 4 clean-cut guys who enchanted America in 1964 and continued to enchant America forever.
That's great. We'll be right back with more about the Beatles in a minute. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Brian Rott, President and CEO of Cart Mart here in Laguna Woods. My family's been in the golf cart business since 1959, and we win our customers over with the simple belief of we treat you right. We are proud to be the authorized dealer for Club Cart here in Orange County and your go-to source for the sales and service to other major brands. We're conveniently located on El Toro Road, just minutes from Laguna Woods. So come by and see for yourself, while when doing business with Cart Mart, there's no reason to go anywhere else.
Hi, I'm John Bowser Bauman. You probably know me best as Bowser from Sha Na Na, but I'm also president of Social Security Works PAC. And you know, when I'm in Laguna Woods, I always watch Village Television. Grease for peace.
Hi, welcome back, and we are talking still with Ivor Davis about his experiences with the Beatles. And before we get into I know there were a lot of warm-up acts for the Beatles that have gone on to fame and fortune themselves, but I just want to ask you something that some people have asked me to ask you, actually. Were there any infighting instances with the Beatles, or did they ever get on each other's nerves, or could they just roll with the punches, or, you know?
I must say, Francine, that every time I was with them, I never saw any punch-ups. I never saw any personal vendettas against each other. I mean, as remarkable as this may seem, they were, when they got on stage, they were a cohesive force, and there was no pummeling, there was no nastiness that I witnessed. Now, they may have, if they had a few drinks, they might have got a bit testy with each other, but I never saw anything that I could say that John hated Paul and Paul hated so-and-so. Don't forget, they were pretty unified, because not long earlier in that year, they had ejected their drummer, Pete Best.
Right.
Pete Best was a good-looking guy. He started with the Beatles, and then all of a sudden, Pete Best was no longer a Beatle, and they hired Ringo. And so Ringo came in realizing that he was possibly expendable. So that's what I said about drummers.
We're expendable, you say? We're fun.
They're fun. Oh, yes, I know. I mean, but aren't drummers supposed to be a little bit crazy?
I asked my husband about that.
Would you report back, please?
Yes, I will. Okay, now I know that you said the Righteous Brothers were one of the preamble bands, the first. They opened for the Beatles several times.
The Beatles had 3 or 4 different warm-up groups, and as I mentioned, who cared about them? They could have had the Moscow State Fair.
Yeah.
Doing the warm-up act. We just want the Beatles. That's all they wanted. But the Righteous Brothers were not as famous as they became. And what happened was they performed maybe for the first 2.5 weeks, and then finally, when we were in New York, the Beatles arrived in a helicopter at the stadium, at the outdoor stadium, the tennis center just outside Manhattan.
Right.
And the helicopter landed in the middle of the Righteous Brothers singing. So we couldn't hear the Righteous Brothers. Finally, the Righteous Brothers went to Brian Epstein and said, look, we enjoy playing for the Beatles, but can you let us out our contract? And Brian, I'll give him credit, allowed them to leave in the middle of the tour because they were unhappy about the way they were being treated. They went on to great fame on their own. And there was a guy called Clarence Frogman Henry, who was a kind of bluesy singer that took over from them. And Jackie DeShannon, who's still around, she stuck it out for the whole tour. So that was really the pecking order of the opening act.
Okay, I'm curious. The Beatles were on stage for 26 minutes. How long were their opening acts on stage for?
I would guess that the opening acts were on stage for longer than the Beatles for the first half.
You'd have to give the audience some music, some substance.
But Francine, the remarkable thing was that nobody complained that I heard of that the Beatles only gave them less than half an hour. They came to see the Beatles, and to be honest with you, that's why at the end of when the Beatles finally broke up, John said, "We're like a circus freak show. I don't want to do this anymore. People are coming along not to hear our music because they couldn't hear. They've come along to see us. We're like a traveling freak show, and so we don't want to do that anymore. We want to stop touring." And they did stop touring, and they went back to the studio to Abbey Road with George Martin, their brilliant composer, producer, and they produced a lot of great music. Because if I may just say, on that first American tour, if you remember some of the songs, I mean, you were too young to remember, of course.
Yeah, but I listen to them now.
Oh, of course. Well, they made, the songs were kind of what I would call lollipop music. It was, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves Me, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. It's not too sophisticated. It wasn't until they got in the studio with George Martin, the producer, that they turned all the great songs that most of us know today. So in those days it was straight up and down music, nothing too elaborate, loud, noisy by the Beatles and noisy by the audiences.
Okay, well, you were with them so closely. Looking back, what is your favorite song that they performed back then?
Well,
the early Beatles.
Funnily enough, it's not a Beatle song. It was called Long Tall Sally. And the reason is, first of all, my wife, who I wasn't married to at the time, was named Sally.
Sally, yes.
And so that was nice. But I should tell you, what happened was, once I heard Long Tall Sally, I knew that was my exit strategy, because that was the last song. And as soon as we heard Long Tall, those of us, the DJs, ran backstage, jumped into limousine number 2. Limousine number 1 was warming up, and we knew that if we better get out the stadium fast. As soon as the Beatles finished, we were in the limo. I was in the limousine number 2. Out came the Beatles running, jumped into limo number 1, and we were roaring out of the stadium before anybody even got to their feet. We were gone, back to the hotel, to the airport, to wherever. But the other thing was that the Beatles used many tricky techniques to escape their fans. And I can tell you, on one occasion they got into an ambulance, and the ambulance went roaring out with a red light screaming. They went in a meat truck. They escaped in a meat truck.
In a meat truck, okay.
And all sorts of armored cars to get away, because they did want to hang around. So back to your original question, Long Tall Sally, and I never really heard Long Tall Sally sang until the very end, because I was in the limo by the time the Beatles left the stage.
There are 2 living Beatles now. Do you have any contact with them at all?
I did see Ringo a couple of times. He plays with the Ringo All-Star Band.
Mm-hmm.
He's touring the world. And what happens is, when you go backstage, there's like 200 people lining up. And to be honest with you, I know that I don't want to impinge, but I did 2 years ago go to his birthday party, and Paul lives in a different stratosphere. Although Paul likes to, Paul, a friend of mine in Liverpool, said that Paul showed up in Liverpool, and they have 8-foot statues of marble in the Liverpool Centre Square, and Paul was there. Believe it or not, he just dropped in, and people were just boggled because Paul McCartney posed in front of his statue.
Oh.
This was about a week ago.
A week ago? Oh my gosh.
From now, yes. So
wow.
Paul gets around, but I'm sure, you can imagine if Paul showed up at a shopping centre or in a restaurant, he'd be mobbed, and so would Ringo. So they are fairly carefully scrutinized, but I know for sure that Paul likes to get out and about in a semi-disguise. So if you see a semi-disguised looking guy who's Paul McCartney, it probably is.
Okay, I'll keep my eyes open for
Good,
that.
good.
And one last thing before we move on. Didn't I read about them with Elvis?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
Let's talk about Elvis and the Beatles.
That was remarkable.
Yes.
Now, John Lennon grew up loving Elvis, and he always wanted to meet Elvis. During the first year of the tour, a lot of movie stars and hangers-on wanted to meet the Beatles, and the Beatles didn't want to meet too many people. They met Bob Dylan, they met Joan Baez, but a lot of the movie star people, Liberace, they weren't crazy about. They met Liberace, but he came backstage in Las Vegas. So many people wanted to meet them, and what happened was Elvis was top of their hit parade. 1964, Elvis was working on movies. The Beatles were running around the country. They never met. 1965, I got a call. I knew that was going to happen. Get over here. We're going over to meet Elvis. So I went over to the house where they were renting in Beverly Hills. We took the 2 limousines. We went to Elvis's mansion. He'd bought a house. He lived in Beverly Hills because he was making a lot of fairly crappy movies.
Well,
3 or 4 movies a year. The same movie, a different leading lady.
Yeah, that's what they've been described as.
And there we were. And the Beatles were very excited. In fact, they always refer to the fact that they managed to have a couple of cups of tea on the way over to the house, which was a sort of code word for something a little bit stronger. So by the time they got there, they were all a little bit merry. But when we went into Elvis's house, there was Elvis and his Memphis Mafia sitting around, and I remember being a fly on the wall there, because for the first 10 minutes, nobody said anything. They sat around, and there was Elvis looking like Elvis, but I always remember he had sideburns that were like the old shag carpeting. I remember the shag carpeting, and it was so deep. Mm-hmm. Finally, after 10 minutes of nobody doing anything, nobody acting as a go-between, Elvis jumped up and said, "Hey, didn't you guys come over to jam? Otherwise, I'm going to bed." Well, of course, that broke the ice. And then the Beatles started playing with Elvis. Ringo went to play billiards, snooker in the other room because he didn't have his drums. No drums. And they played for about 20 minutes, just off the cuff, and mostly Elvis music. No,
that's Beatles what I was going to ask. Elvis music or Beatles music?
No, Elvis music, yeah. a little bit of black soul music. The Beatles enjoyed that, and they started getting, harmonizing, and that was quite amazing. But I should tell you this, the rules were no photographers, no tape recorders. Nobody took a picture of the meetings of these two great music legend groups.
And there were no cell phones. You
no
couldn't
cell
sneak
phones.
us.
I always say, to be honest with you, my only regret in 1964 was I never took my cell phone with me.
Well, okay, you're forgiven for that one.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So nobody has a picture of Elvis and the Beatles. And I'll tell you, if we have time for a very quick follow-up, the Beatles loved that. They had a great time with Elvis finally. But in the years gone by, they became very upset with Elvis because Elvis bad-mouthed the Beatles to Richard Nixon. Elvis was he wanted to get a drug enforcement agency honorary badge.
Right.
And he went to see Richard Nixon, and I've seen his letters to Nixon, and he told Nixon, well, the Beatles came to America, they earned a lot of money, they took the money back to England, and they bad-mouthed America, which wasn't true. Well, once the Beatles heard that, they were very upset with Elvis. But Elvis was trying to charm Richard Nixon and get his badge, which he did get his badge, and also he claimed to Nixon that he was going to tell his fervent supporters to vote for Richard Nixon for president.
Well,
so that was Elvis's dirty deeds.
and that went against everything the Beatles were doing because
Exactly.
they were definitely anti-Nixon at the time.
Well, if you remember, Richard Nixon tried to get John Lennon deported
right?
from New York because John Lennon was doing an anti-Vietnam War speech, and they tried very hard to get him deported. John Lennon fought for 5 years in New York and finally won and never got deported. Now, which leaves me with a footnote, and I'll ask you the question. Can you imagine if John Lennon had been deported, he wouldn't have been at the Dakota Apartments
No.
that night?
There's always what if this hadn't happened. And that leads us to our second half of the show. And so we'll be back in a few minutes, and we'll talk with Ivor about his experience in the Ambassador Hotel at the time Robert Kennedy was assassinated. We'll be right back.
I'm a strong believer that there's something for everyone out there. But some people never stop searching. I've looked long and hard through these parts, and I thank my lucky stars I stumbled across a special place, a unique place, where you never know what you'll find. The Trading Post, only on Channel 6.
Hey Laguna Woods, it's Ken.
And Lisa.
Did you miss an episode of This Day? Not to worry, head over to youtube.com and search Village Television.
Here you can find each episode of This Day and other community programs such as Good Day OC, Discovering Laguna Woods, and much more.
Just click the red subscribe button, then click the bell to be emailed every time we upload a video.
Don't miss out.
And subscribe today.
Welcome back. Right now we are speaking with Ivor Davis. We're gone on from the Beatles, and we're going to talk about his experience with Robert Kennedy. He was assigned to cover Robert Kennedy's final campaign, and tell us how that came to be.
I worked for the London Daily Express, and we were doing a book about the election that year. And fortunately or unfortunately, I was given Robert Kennedy to cover in California.
I would say that's fortunate.
Fortunately. Well, I say because we know what happened to Robert Kennedy. So as a journalist, it was a dream assignment. It was a dream assignment because, first of all, Robert Kennedy was the man who could be king. He could have followed in the footsteps, and I always say bring Camelot back to America after the terrible assassination of his John, his brother. So there I was in California covering Bobby, and Bobby had incredible charisma. Bobby affected so many lives. He was a Prince Charming with energy, and if I may throw the question back at you a little bit, Francine, you were young. Why was Bobby such a mesmerizing figure?
I don't know. I definitely was young at the time. I was, I think, 11 years old, 12 maybe. He struck a chord in me that nobody else ever had other than anybody in my family. And at that young age, I realized what an impact someone can have. And he is responsible for that. He set me on the course. I worked in politics for a long time. Before I came into entertainment journalism, I was in government, and it was because of Robert Kennedy. And at that young age, I knew this guy had something that I needed to latch on to.
Yes.
I stayed up for every election at that young age and watched everything. And the day of the California primary, at the end, I was going to bed, and they announced he was going to win, so I didn't stay up for the ending. I knew he was going to win. I thought, he's got it, I'm going to go to bed. And I woke up to the news.
Yes.
So.
Well, I will take you back to the kitchen of the ambassador in a minute, but during our pre-conversation, you mentioned something, and again, if you don't mind me asking you, you worked for Teddy Kennedy.
I did briefly.
Briefly, but so my question in a way is, Teddy could have taken the mantle of the Kennedys. It didn't happen.
Teddy didn't have, at the time I worked for him, he didn't have the gumption that he had at the end of his campaign. I was hired by his brother-in-law, Steve Smith, who you will talk about later.
Yes.
But yeah, I have many relationships with some of the Kennedy family, and Teddy didn't have what Robbie had.
Yes.
There was no way.
Yes. Yes, he did come along much later in his career and blossomed at a later age, but he didn't run. But Bobby did have the magic, and I saw him. People on the campaign trail 50 years ago, this June, Bobby was set for the White House. And when I saw him, people wanted to touch him. And what I thought was incredible was wherever we went, San Francisco, San Diego, the lettuce fields, the California heartland, people wanted to touch him. And they touched him and they held his hand so much that at the end of the campaign, in early June, his hands were bruised and blooded from touching people. They just wanted. And there was a guy that was on the campaign that was his human anchor, hung on to Bobby so that he wasn't pulled into the crowd.
And I do remember him, some of the members saying that he had to go to plastic cufflinks because his cufflinks were always being torn off.
Absolutely. I mean, they wanted, I don't think it was deliberate, but they
wanted a piece of him.
They wanted a piece of him. And so if I may jump to the night.
Go ahead, you were there.
The night of the election, I was covering it. I was at the Ambassador Hotel. Bobby knew he was going to win over Eugene McCarthy. A week earlier, he'd lost to Eugene McCarthy in Oregon, but now in California, which had 174 delegates to the convention, which is a big number of delegates, Bobby had it pretty well in his hand, which would have sent him to the convention as the favorite. He made a speech. He was tired. He said, on to Chicago. And then we were going to go to a press conference. And Bobby and his bodyguards, Rayford Johnson, who was a decathlon champion, and
Rosie Greer.
Rosie Greer, the football player, got separated. Bobby got taken through this kitchen pantry area. I followed maybe 30 to 40 paces behind, and I heard balloons bursting. I thought it was balloons bursting, 5 or 6 or 7, and screaming. Women started screaming. I rushed to the pantry door, and Stephen Smith, who was Bobby's brother-in-law, stopped me, and I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Hang on." And being the journalist that I was, I wanted to see what was going on in the pantry. And what happened was that he grabbed me by my cuff here, and I just, I was probably too enthusiastic. I pushed my way through, and he ripped my whole
The sleeve, your sleeve off?
the sleeve off. Absolutely ripped off. But it didn't, but it was, and I looked in there, and there was Bobby on the a cold floor by the ice machine, bleeding badly. There was Ethel just saying, "Give him air, give him room." I remember she put his head on a one of those old-fashioned those straw hats.
The campaign hats.
Campaign
yes.
hat as a cushion. Women were saying, "Not again." Somebody was screaming. A radio man was saying, "Get the gun, get the gun." It was total bedlam. Everything going on there. And then I also, of course, noticed a guy called Harry Benson, who was the photographer that was working with me on the Daily Express. He had jumped on a kitchen table, a metal kitchen table, and was doing what photographers do, take pictures. Bobby was bleeding. That somehow there were other people wounded. I didn't know who was injured badly. You've got to realize it was a cauldron of excitement and horror in that kitchen, screaming, just bedlam. And finally, we kind of withdrew. The ambulance guys came in. I saw that Bobby was no longer talking.
Well, had you seen him mumble words prior? Because he did say a few things.
Bobby actually said, and to be honest with you, piecing it together, he said, "Is everybody all right?"
Right.
He was worried about other people. I noticed that one of the kitchen staff leaning down and giving him something. I didn't know what it was. It turned out to be rosary beads. And Ethel was absolutely ridiculous. And in one side there was this guy in blue jeans under a pile of bodies. And that turned out to be his assassin, Sirhan. And everybody was in shock. Had we seen what we saw? I mean, it's
unbelievable. You don't really know what you saw. You're trying to piece it together in your head, but you're also watching everything going on.
You are, and it's kind of like a slow motion thing, because as soon as they took Bobby away, and I saw Bobby was not saying anything, they took him away. We all withdrew from the pantry. The cops came. We sat around, we said, now, we kind of like tried to piece it together, because all sorts of things were going on. There were 4 people that were wounded, and then we went to the hospital, and they said, Bobby is undergoing surgery. What do you do? I must say, I when he was at the hospital, I ran to a coin box and called my London office and dictated, I don't even know what. I mean, it made the front page. They said, give us everything. So I dictated off the top of my head for the first edition of the paper, went to the hospital, and we sat around saying, did you see this? Did you see that?
Well, you had a press pass. You were allowed in the hospital, or you were only in the front of it?
We all had our campaign badges. Bobby's people knew who we were, because I'd been on the train with Bobby, Whittle Stop train. I'd been at the on the bus when we did the cities of San Francisco and stuff like that. But in San Francisco, we went through Chinatown a day before, and I want to tell you that we heard explosions, and Bobby actually winced at the explosions, and of course they were firecrackers. That was harmless. So that was in San Francisco 24 hours before. And so there we were, not knowing what was going on, sitting around talking to each other, swapping information with the other news people, television people. No cohesive story. Who was the guy? We didn't know at the time. We just knew that he'd been carted off. And then he got shot on June the 5th, shortly after midnight, 12:30 a.m. on June the 5th. 6 hours later, we were back at the hospital, and Frank Mankiewicz, who is his campaign manager, stood up and announced Bobby had died.
Right.
Bobby died on June the 6th, 1968 at 1:44 a.m.
Right. That's
And
etched in our memory.
etched in our memory, and that night was etched in our memory. And even today, we were talking before your show about one of the Kennedy children saying there was another gunman.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. You said you might have heard 7 or 8 shots.
Yes.
Because apparently Sirhan only had 6 shots in his gun.
Yes.
Robert Kennedy Jr. and Paul Schrade, who was gravely injured
Yes.
in that kitchen, both are on of the opinion now that they need to reopen the case because they think if there's more than 6 shots, somebody else was there as well.
Well, there's always going to, even with John Kennedy, was there a second shooter? But all I can tell you is on the night of the shooting, I wrote a story for London saying police are looking for a woman in a polka dot
Right.
dress. Now, much later, we pieced it together, and it turned out there was a woman in a polka dot dress, and a witness said this woman was screaming, "We've shot Bobby." Now, I want to say that it could be easily misconstrued as they've shot Bobby, because why would somebody who's just tried to assassinate Bobby Kennedy stand in the kitchen and scream, "We've shot Bobby"? I think it was in the confusion, in the noise, in the madness, that it was they've shot Bobby.
Yeah, and in a time like that, you never, I mean, things get so out of whack. But I just actually last night finished reading Bobby Jr.'s book, and he does lay a lot of groundwork to the fact of his suspicions.
Yes.
So it might be worthwhile to reopen the case. It's up to the powers that be to do that, but you were there. When you saw Bobby and Ethel on the floor, was Ethel panicked? Was she calm? What was her demeanor?
Ethel was frantic. Ethel, the picture that Harry Benson took is one that is kind of horribly iconic. She has her hand up there. She's saying, "Give him air, give him air." She was in shock. She was pregnant with their 11th child at the time. She'd been a real trooper on the campaign. She was pregnant. She was on the campaign. Bobby, pregnant Ethel, and their dog Freckles. I don't know if you ever met Freckles, but
No, actually he was Bobby Jr.'s dog.
Oh, okay. Well, now I know. But the interesting thing is, who knows a second gun? But the interesting thing is, I covered the trial as well, and Sirhan confessed to shooting Bobby. Now, I don't think Sirhan was sophisticated enough. Was he used by somebody? He said he was drunk. He said he couldn't remember. He said he didn't like Bobby because of Bobby's attitude towards Israel and Palestine, and that's why he did it. And if you look at the young Sirhan, I don't think he's the kind of person. He could have been used as a dummy. He could have been a Manchurian candidate.
We don't know that, and I don't think I don't know. It's not for us to speculate because there's too many options,
Yes.
to go that. But were you at the hospital when Jacqueline came?
No, I was not there when she came. What happened was, when they came to the hospital, not surprisingly, they were whisked in through back doors, and I don't think, and I you could correct me, I don't think she showed up for pictures.
No.
I don't even think there were people who got anything of her. Maybe arriving at the airport.
The airport's the only photos I've seen of her.
Sure, and I think they announced the whole nation was in just total utter shock.
And it has been written many, many times that the assassination of Robert Kennedy was more shocking and more disturbing to the country than that of JFK.
Yes.
Because it really changed the whole direction of this country.
Well, in all the books that have been written, many of them say that Bobby somehow realize that he may end up another victim. I mean,
It was always in his mind.
Wasn't
yes, he wrote about it, and he spoke about it several times.
Yeah, so
yes.
So I mean, do you go out in life and?
Yes. Okay. Well, I really want to thank you for coming by with your fascinating stories. And Ivor has his book, The Beatles and Me on Tour. Pick it up. It's full of many, many, many more stories than we just barely touched on it. And his, are you writing anything about Bobby Kennedy's? Are you going to write a book about that?
I don't think I'm going to write a book about Bobby Kennedy, but like you, there's always some wonderful stories about dealing with politicians and showbiz people that you never actually wrote about when you wrote about them. So I might do something about something like I had a crazy title called I've got to interview Julia Roberts, but there's a dead cat under the house. And I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I actually went. Was going to interview Julia Roberts, and somebody called me up just as I was about to leave and said that we think there's a dead cat under the house. I said, I can't help you because I'm going to see Julia Roberts, and she's going to talk about marrying Kiefer Sutherland.
Oh.
But I'm sure there's.
We all have stories like that.
We do.
Anyway, thank you for joining us. This has been Beyond the Red Carpet. I'm Francine Brokaw, and we'll see you next time.